Okay, it is 6 o'clock on Wednesday evening, and this is Advanced Kentucky's final prep session for the AP Environmental Science exam. I'm pleased to introduce again Debbie Wheeler. Many of you know her as one of our go-to consultants, and Debbie is a environmental science teacher at Sarah School and a NIMSY and AP Environmental Science consultant. And so Debbie will go over the mock exam and give you some final hints, I hope. Just a reminder, for our meeting etiquette, we've got quite a few participants, so please turn off your microphone and your video, but feel free to use the chat room. We will be polling, and that is anonymous, so please do participate in that. Debbie will be asking you to critically look at some of the questions at the mock exam responses. This session will be recorded and posted on kyap2020.com. So if you're looking for something to do between now and the exam on Monday, that will be available for you. So once again, let me turn the floor over to Debbie.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm going to go ahead and get my presentation started here. Thanks for taking time out of your day to join me. And I think we've got a good bit of material here to share with you. And I wanted you to see my little butterfly, if I can get it, my little hummingbird, if I can get it going. Okay. So I just thought that was cool. All right, so this is our final review. We're gonna get geared up to be ready for that exam on Monday. I just wanted to go over briefly the format, and then we'll practice some deconstruction of the mock exam that you took and really dig into some strategies that can help you do well. So just remember that they've cut out a couple of our units. So the ones eligible for the exam are 1 through 7. The ones that are not included on the exam are units 8 and 9, and that's aquatic and terrestrial pollution, which is things like sewage treatment plants and solid waste and that sort of thing, eutrophication, and global change, which I hope you know about climate change. It's so important in some of the parts of that, but it's not going to be included on this test. The next thing I wanted to make sure that you have ready for you on exam day is your e-ticket email. So you should receive that 2 days before the exam, which I assume will be, Saturday, maybe Friday. They'll send out your e-ticket. And there's a checklist that you want to make sure that you take a look at. I'll give you a website link so that you can take a look at what that checklist is. Decide what kind of device you're going to use, a laptop, a tablet, a smartphone, a desktop computer, and then make sure that you have an updated browser. That's really important, a strong internet connection, and be sure that you use the demo that they have in order to make sure that all of those things are working so that you don't have stress or any mishaps on exam day. If you're typing your responses, College Board recommends that you have Microsoft Word, Google Docs, Notes, or some other app to keep track of that. You are permitted to use class notes or study guides or textbooks or other classroom resources or previous assignments or assessments. And again, all of that is on that website down at the bottom, cb.org/AP2020, get ready. I am going to show you a couple of organizational ways to prepare for the exam. So when you think about using your notes, you want to be pretty intentional about what you have with you, what you've got on hand. Okay, there's going to be 2 questions. So the first question is going to be designing an investigation. And we had that on the mock exam. We're going to go through the important parts of that. You're going to have a timer that starts at 30 minutes. You should take 25 minutes to finish question 1. And then when that timer turns red, showing you have 5 minutes left, you should start your upload. Once you're finished with that question, you'll start question 2. Again, question 2, you'll have 15 minutes. The timer will say 20 minutes. After 15 minutes, it is going to turn red. You have 5 minutes left, and that's when you should start the upload process. Okay. All right. I've got any questions, feel free to chime in on the chat room. I'm using my iPad, so you may see me listed twice here to try and monitor those questions. And I'm sure Lou will help me point out if there's a question that I've missed along the way.
I am Debbie, but before we get going with the questions, hello all, I want to just share with you an experience that some of the physics test takers had, and that is, while it's possible to submit a photo of work, only not every format is supported, and particularly some newer iPhones apparently store photographs in an HEIC format rather than the JPEG, BMP, or PNG formats. So if you are planning on taking a picture of your work, make sure that you either take it in a format that's supported or can convert it to a format that is supported before you submit it. Unfortunately, what these physics students did was they got the message that their submission was received, but then later they got a message that the file was corrupt or unreadable by the College Board. And I don't know why that is, but just a word of warning. Check out that demo site that Debbie mentioned and make sure you're ready for it. Okay, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you, Debbie.
Okay, and that is really important to go to that cb.org site. And there are 3 different demos that you can do. You can try it 3 different ways to attach files, to type in it, to do, just feel comfortable that your work's gonna upload exactly as you expect. So thanks, Lou. Okay, question 1, as we talked about, is gonna be design an experiment. And they're either going to give you a situation for this one that you have to design an experiment for, or they're going to give you an experiment and have you analyze it, pull out some information from that. So for our mock exam, you had a question, this first question asked about 2 local ponds that have some observed differences in the number of diversity of worms and insect larvae between the 2 of them. And it asks, the student decided to investigate some of the abiotic factors, and they want you to list 3 water quality tests that could be conducted and explain what information each test provides. There's a good video I'm going to reference a little bit later that talks about important words like, identify, explain, describe. That might be something that you want to have next to you when you get ready to take this test. Thinking about what are those definitions so that you can completely answer these questions. Okay, so for this one, it's 5 points for part A, a point for each abiotic test, and then a description of what it measures. So you need to tell us what the test is, what it's going to measure, and then for each parameter, you can get an additional point for an impact statement that links it to a specific effect on organisms. So let's take a look at our first example. Oh, actually, there was a huge table associated with this scoring guide, which I've just crunched down a little bit to give you an idea of, for each test, what is the description look like and what does the impact look like. So again, I've only given you a few of them. There are many more tests that you could have chosen, abiotic tests, but you may have chosen dissolved oxygen. You need to explain that it's telling you the amount of dissolved oxygen. And then the impact is that it's required for aerobic respiration, or it's required for decomposition or cell respiration. For pH, you can see the different ways you can explain the impact. You can just say, pH is a measure of acidic or basic. And then these are the different impacts on the ecosystem depending on the pH. Turbidity is suspended solids. It's also a measure of light penetration. And there are, several impacts depending on turbidity. It can decrease photosynthesis due to light penetration. Make sure that if you're using something like that, like suspended solids, that you make the connection that light penetration decreases, and that's going to decrease photosynthesis. You can see for temperature, there's several different impacts: increased biological stress, a decrease in dissolved oxygen, increased sensitivity to toxic waste and disease, an increase in temperature leading to an increased rate of metabolism. And then I left the ammonia up there. Ammonia is just the level of ammonia, and it can lead to algal blooms. All right, so let's look at our first sample response here. to test some abiotic factors that could contribute to the difference in organisms in the two ponds. There are a lot of tests you can do, multiple tests. One would be a pH test. Many organisms can only thrive within a certain pH level, so testing for it could show if one pond was more acidic or basic than the other, which would explain a difference in organisms. Another good test would be the dissolved oxygen test. Without dissolved oxygen, organisms can't do cellular respiration and would die. So if one pond had a lack of dissolved oxygen or simply less than the other pond, this would also contribute to the difference in organisms. Another good yet simple test would be a temperature test. The warmer the temperature is, the less dissolved oxygen the water can hold, and some organisms can only thrive in a certain temperature range, both of which would contribute to differing organisms between the two ponds. So this is a good example of a response here. The pH test is followed up with an acidic or basic explanation. That's going to award this one a point for that. The dissolved oxygen test, without dissolved oxygen, organisms can't do cellular respiration, so they've got an impact there. They do continue to explain a lack of dissolved oxygen or simply less, and I'm going to flip back a slide to look at our dissolved oxygen levels at the top here. They need to connect some amount of dissolved oxygen with a description of the test, and they did that in the second part of that sentence. So they've earned 2 points. And then the temperature test doesn't require a description. So simply calling it the temperature test would earn them a point for that. And then they say the warmer the temperature is, the less dissolved oxygen the water can hold. And some organisms can only thrive in a certain temperature range. Connecting temperature with dissolved oxygen is going to earn them that point. So let me make sure I hit all of those points. This should be worth 5. So they've got our pH, they've got their dissolved oxygen, they've got their temperature, they've got the impact that, that dissolved oxygen would do, and the impact that temperature would do. So that's all 5 points. Okay, a lot of points were awarded for this one. So I'd like for you, and we'll pull up our poll, I'd like for you to identify this one. And remember, you want to look for 3 abiotic tests and a description of each. And then for 2 of them, hopefully they've got an impact. Okay. So, oops, let me go back one. Take a moment to read this, and you're looking for 3 abiotic tests and an impact for at least 2 of them.
And if you don't see the poll window, you should be able to pull it up from your name in the participant list, and it can be moved out of the way if it's obscuring part of the response or the scoring guidelines.
Yes. Thank you, Lou. As we finish up with our scores, remember these are 3 abiotic tests. So if somebody want to chime in the chat room and what the meaning of abiotic is?
Abiotic is something that's not a physical organism. It's not living. So some factors include just like water, dirt, anything that doesn't really have carbon, breathe, or reproduce. That's basically it.
Awesome. Excellent. All right, we've got 17 folks that have chimed in on the poll. If anybody's interested in voting, go ahead and do that now.
And we've got over 60% of the participants voting, Debbie, which is better than most presidential elections, I think. So we'll just end the polling in 3, 2. I know there's a lot of reading here, but let's not wait too long.
All right. Okay, so this I scored as a 3. And one of the things that I think is deceptive is we do E. coli tests when we do water testing, but it is not an abiotic factor. So we can't count the fecal coliform test for E. coli in our examples. The pH test, testing the number of hydrogen ions in solution, that's a point, so we can definitely point that one. This pH too high or too low may cause organisms to die and could even be a sign of other pollutants. It's a little bit vague. If you notice, it does say on our table, and I'm going to go back maybe and then come back over to this page. It does say on our table increased stress with pH changes. They could have said something about mortality of eggs in juveniles. But simply it could cause organisms to die. I'm not sure that the reader would give credit for that. It's a little bit too vague. One last test is turbidity. Turbidity measures the amount of suspended particles. Excellent. They definitely earn points for that. Suspended particles and sediments hold heat, which lowers the water's ability to hold dissolved oxygen. And that is really great information. They describe that well because that's not something that anybody that hadn't taken our course would necessarily know. So this was a 3-point earned response on that. Any questions about why they earned that score or why they maybe didn't earn as many points as you thought?
And this may be, surprising to many students because this looks like a very well-crafted paragraph. They've used a lot of the right words, and this, I think, for those of you who might not know, I've scored AP chemistry exams for many, many years, and I've watched the mock scoring of biology and physics as well as the environmental science, and really make sure you answer the question and be specific. Try not to write in general statements that would be bullet points on a PowerPoint. Be specific, answer the question. Right,
and pay attention to those words like biotic and abiotic. Because this is somebody who knows what they're talking about, but they just made an error in including fecal coliform. Okay.
This could be, sorry to interrupt again, but this could easily have been a 5-point response without too much editing.
Yes. Yep. And I think if they'd gone back and noticed that they put in fecal coliform, they could have definitely substituted it with something more appropriate. All right. The next section really gets into our design of the experiment. Larvae of a certain insect are found in pond A, but not in pond B. Design a controlled experiment that would help explain the observed distribution of these insect larvae, and be sure to include the following in your design. Hypothesis, the variable that will be manipulated. We're going to outline the field or laboratory procedures to be followed, and then describe the data and possible results. Now this part of the free response allowed for several different point options. That's probably not going to be the case here, but it does allow us to analyze some different ways to design an experiment. So we're going to look for hypothesis. That's going to give us 1 point. We're going to look for a specific independent variable. Notice they can't just say chemicals. They can't just say pollutants or pesticides. It needs to be something specific. And then for our procedures, we're looking for a manipulation of the independent variable, up, down, a range of different test situations of that variable. A control group could earn a point, data that's quantifiable, and a dependent variable like the number of larvae, size, movement, mortality of larvae, those kinds of things. And then finally, a point for elaboration. And that's all part of our procedure. The fourth part of this section is connect the data to the larvae distribution in the 2 ponds. So let's look at one way they could answer this question. So our hypothesis, remember, is number 1. As temperature increases, oh, there's a little bit of a typo there. As temperature increases, the number of larvae will decrease. What's good about this is it's giving us a directionality for both variables. Our independent variable is temperature, and they identify that as number 2, but they're telling us what direction it's going to go in. The number of larvae are also given a direction. Temperature goes up, larvae goes down. So there's a point for number 1, and then number 2, describing or identifying the variable to be tested, temperature, that's their second point. So let's look at their design. There will be 3 buckets of water that have almost identical conditions, except one has warm water, one has cold water, and one has an average temperature. That statement right there gives us manipulation of the variable. And that's an important part to include in your experiment. If you're writing this down, make sure you write down, show manipulation of the independent variable. They go on to say, we will put the same amount of larvae in each bucket and maintain conditions. And hopefully that hearing the same amount kind of triggered, oh, constants. They're giving us some constants. The maintain conditions, maybe a little bit of a cop-out. I wish they'd gone on to tell us what kind of conditions they're talking about, what kinds of variables they're gonna maintain, keep the same. But they've got quite a bit in here. So we have 3 points so far, maybe 4 if we want to say the same amount of larvae is giving us a constant there. To measure data for this experiment, I will count the population of each bucket at the end. They're telling us what their dependent variable is. Remember, there's only 4 necessary points here, so they've got a lot. They're doing really well. I believe that the cold temperature bucket will have the most amount of larvae in it, and the warm bucket will have the least amount of larvae in it. I believe this is the case because the temperature of water can have a large effect on the water. And when the temperatures increase, there's less dissolved oxygen for organisms to use. Also, it creates a disability for the water to hold oxygen as well. So this was a sample that I took directly from one of my students. Remember number 4, and I'm going to go back. Number 4, they need to connect the data to the larvae distribution in the 2 ponds. So in this instance, because they haven't connected that data, they wouldn't earn those points, but they earned 4 points before they even got to that point, and this is a 4-point question. Before I have you score 1, are there any questions about that? About how we score that question? I'm looking in the chat room if anybody wants to chime in. Okay. All right, well, let me go ahead and give you a question to try. So remember, 1 is the hypothesis, 2 is the independent variable, 3 is their setup, and 4 is a connection to the pond. And I'll go ahead and start our poll. There's a total of 4 points available here. Please take a minute to read that and then score it if you would. All right, we're at almost 50%. Go ahead and chime in. This one shouldn't take quite as long as our last one. All right, we're over 60%. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'll go ahead and stop it there and share our results. So this scored 2 points, and let's take a look at that. For the first hypothesis there, if dissolved oxygen levels are different, then the number of insect larvae found will be different. There's no directionality. They can't earn points for that hypothesis without telling us, what about the oxygen levels are going to change, then what about the insect larvae are going to be different? They do give us a specific variable. Dissolved oxygen levels will be measured and tested. So that's awesome. So they earn that point for sure. And then they say, set up multiple containers and test the dissolved oxygen levels in each multiple times. They are not manipulating the dissolved oxygen variable. They would need to be specific about those, containers having different amounts of dissolved oxygen. They do get a point for telling us that the containers were going to be tested on the same day and at the same time, and all other abiotic factors will remain the same, although that's, again, a little bit, vague. It's not as specific as I would prefer. For number 4, remember they're supposed to relate the data in this experiment to the 2 ponds. If there is no difference in larvae at any dissolved oxygen level, then another variable should be tested. So they don't give us that information. And they also don't even talk about what the dependent variable is, which was ultimately number of insect larvae. So there should be something in their design that talks about the insect larvae that they're going to measure. Okay, so that was a 2-point question. We did have 2-point as the most commonly chosen answer, so that's awesome. Before we move on to the next part, are there any questions or comments about that?
Do you see the question?
I do.
Debbie?
In the last example, how does the experiment help explain why the larvae are found in pond A and pond B? Hayden, are you talking about the first example I gave you? I think you might be. This one certainly doesn't. The first one did not either. And that may be what you're getting at. I'm going to go back to that first slide. They did not, yes, the temperature one. Okay. They did not earn a point for part 4. But because of this, I'm going to go back one more. Because there were multiple ways you could get up to that 4-point maximum, they still got 4 points even though they didn't get that one. That's not necessarily going to be true for the test that we take on Monday. They don't give us all those multiple option points anymore. But this one got 4 points because it hit some of these other internal points without that one. So thank you for your question. Okay, there aren't any other questions about this design part. I'll go ahead and...
Debbie, do you see we have one more question?
On last example, where did he get his 2nd point from? His use of constants. In his design, he talked about the things that he was going to keep the same. So that's how he earned those points. Okay, hopefully that got you a little more comfortable with experimental design. The last part of this question was, what are indicator species and how are they used to assess environmental quality? Give a specific example of such a species and its use. This was a 3-point section. So you get a point for defining what an indicator species is. So make sure you know your vocabulary for this test. And you also get a point for giving a specific example. And then the 3rd point comes from linking that species to a specific environmental change. And again, we want to be specific. So they give you a few caveats. 1 point can be awarded if an atypical indicator species is used and an environmental change is indicated. They give you a whole possible list of accepted species. And then they give you some species that aren't going to be accepted. Okay, let's take a minute and look at an example here. I was able to keep the scoring guide, at least part of it, up so that you could read the example and see the scoring guide. Let's look through this together. An indicator species is an organism that has a specific and narrow range of tolerance for any given factor in an ecosystem. They can be used to measure the quality of an ecosystem, and they can be used to monitor changes in an ecosystem. That's a good definition because they're telling us that it's going to warn us or be a warning sign for environmental change. And that's really the word that I'm looking for when I'm thinking about defining that species. Then they go on to give us an example. So they earned a point for their definition. One example would be salamanders. And you can see down here at the bottom, they are among the amphibians that are accepted. And they go on to say these organisms are very delicate and susceptible to any changes in their environment. If an area with salamanders becomes too hot, too acidic, or too cold, the salamander population will decrease. I'm so glad they left that extra sentence in there. Including that extra detail really makes for a better answer and earns them that third point. So this is a 3-point question, and that example earned 3 points. Are there any questions about how they earn those 3 points before we check out another example? Okay. So let's look at another sample. And we'll start our poll, and I'll give you the opportunity to read through and score that sample. Almost up to 50%.
So this is a 3-point maximum. So those of you who are scoring 4 or 5 points are very, very generous.
Yes, only 3 points. All right, we're at 60%. Anybody else want to chime in? Ooh, we're at 70. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. Let's take a look at these results. Like Lou said, really can't earn 4 and 5. And I also scored that as a 1, as most of you did. So their definition of what an indicator species is a good one. Where they lost their points is in their example. So as you can see down here, it says not accepted, canary, elephant fish. All the AP Environmental Science textbooks I've ever used always talk about canaries as an example of an indicator species, but not as an environmental example. So unfortunately, it kind of helps us remember what it means to be an indicator species, but in the natural environment, canary wouldn't be appropriate. I've got a question here in the chat room. Out of curiosity, is there a specific name for an organism that works as an indicator species in a non-natural environment, like the canary in a coal mine? I mean, people that don't study environmental science probably aren't going to use the word indicator species. I don't think we necessarily have a name for that. It's just indicator species is listing natural species in an ecosystem. That's the way environmental scientists use it. Okay. There aren't any questions about that one. We'll go ahead and move on and take a look at our next question type. Don't see any more questions popping up, so I'll assume we're okay. All right, question number 2. So question 2 is going to be some sort of environmental problem. And once we go through this, I've got some strategies for you to think about how to address environmental problems, okay? All right, for this question, it was about national park visibility. One reason that people visit national parks is to view the scenery. Visibility at the 4 parks in the graph have been reduced over time so that by 2015, the visibility was an average of 70 miles less than the historical visibility. Regional air pollutant sources are commonly located over 100 miles away from national parks. One of the things that I would really advise you is to look at the graph and think about what kind of information it gives you before you ever start to answer the questions or even look at what kind of questions they want to know. So it's my title, it's National Park Visibility Changes. The visibility in miles is along my left axis there. I can see the different national parks listed below. I'm going to look at what my legend tells me. I can see there's some pretty significant, differences in visibility between the parks, but they've all decreased compared to historic levels, which is what that paragraph had told me. I think it very likely on Monday that you are going to get some kind of graph or data set to analyze. So make sure that you take the moment to look at that and see what it tells you before you ever read the questions. Part A says, based on the data provided in the graph, identify the national park that had the greatest loss of visibility as of 2015 when compared with historical natural visibility. Sequoia is our answer. I think most of you guys probably got that on the mock exam. You can tell that they've had the greatest loss of visibility over time. So I'm not going to necessarily quiz us anymore over that part. For this second section, visibility in national parks can be affected by many different air pollutants. So you need to identify a primary air pollutant, describe how it becomes part of the atmosphere, identify a secondary, and describe how it is formed within the atmosphere. And you probably remember from your study of atmosphere that this was a pretty important difference. What's the difference between primary and secondary? What are some examples of each? How does secondary form? So it's not surprising they would ask you to do that. Let's look at an example. Actually, let's go through the scoring guide, then we'll give you an example. So primary air pollutant, you only need to identify one, literally just list it as a bullet point is absolutely fine. So all of these are options: carbon dioxide, monoxide, nitrogen oxides, our NOx and our SOx, our sulfur dioxide, particulate matter or methane or VOCs. Any of those are primary. And why are they primary? That's part two. They are released directly from a specific source, like a smokestack, like a tailpipe, etc. You could also say they're released from the combustion of fossil fuels or from the incomplete combustion of hydrocarbons of fossil fuels like carbon monoxide and particulate matter. Some are going to be directly released from a biological source, methane from cows or from swamps. So those are our part I, part II. And then part III is your secondary air pollutant. Again, you only need to identify it. You could just, ozone is a secondary air pollutant. That's good enough. You could list sulfuric acid, nitric acid, sulfur trioxide, the PANs, or the aldehydes. And then this is the fourth part, I think, is probably most challenging for students to really understand atmosphere. You need to be able to describe the secondary air pollutants and how they form. Most of them are forming due to a reaction with oxygen or water, sunlight or water. So ozone, sulfuric acid, nitric acid, you just need to be able to explain how those are forming in the atmosphere, okay? So typically some sort of a reaction occurring in the presence of sunlight, either reacting with water or reacting with oxygen in that example. Okay, let's look at a sample response. Fairly straightforward. I left the prompt up there at the top so you could see. A primary air pollutant could be carbon monoxide gas from cars. So this response is going to earn a point for saying carbon monoxide. Part two, it becomes part of the atmosphere from burning gas in a combustion engine. It's released from the exhaust of cars. This would earn a point. I really would prefer they said tailpipe, but the exhaust of cars, I think, is sufficient to surpass that hurdle and earn that point. A secondary air pollutant is ozone. That's accurate. They've earned a point there. I put 4 I's instead of IV. Okay. It is formed when hydrocarbons and nitrogen oxides combine with sunlight. They then become ozone. They did not really surpass the hurdle of explaining the reaction with sunlight. And so I would not give them that 4th point. Could you have said acid rain for secondary pollutants? Kaylee, I'm going to come back to that question because I want you to score 1 and then we'll address that. So let me have you take a look at the secondary air pollutants, and the verbiage there is what they need to have. And then let's score 1 and then I'll answer that question of yours, Kaylee. So here is your sample question. Let me turn on your poll. And remember, this is worth 4 points. okay? One for each of those parts. If you would, score this response. And Kaylee, now you can see why I didn't want to give you that answer quite yet. All right, we're at almost 40%. And I'm sorry I can't keep the whole scoring guide up as you answer those. All right, almost 60. Let's get a couple more responses in before we break this down. Okay, 66%. I'm going to give you your countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's end our poll and share our results. Okay, this was a 2-pointer. So let's see why most people said 3. Let's see why they didn't get all 3 of those points. Probably we can all agree, carbon dioxide, easily a primary air pollutant. A primary pollutant could be burned in an industry like a power plant. When coal is burned, carbon dioxide is one of the pollutants emitted. So I would give a point for this, even though that first sentence is a little bit off. A primary pollutant results from, coal being burned in a power plant. So that's a little bit iffy, that the way that statement is, but I would go ahead and give them that point for, carbon dioxide being released from the burning of coal. For part 3, is acid rain a secondary air pollutant? It is not. Now, some of the material that we would say contributes to acid rain, sulfuric acid and nitric acid, those would be great examples of secondary air pollutant, but they can't just say acid rain. You guys have taken this class, you should know those details. So it's important that you include them and that you show the reader that you know those details. And then the last part of their question, the last part of their response, as a result of the presence of primary pollutants, secondary pollutants such as acid rain occur when such pollutants like sulfur dioxide get released into the atmosphere, resulting in altered acidic precipitation. What would have earned them a point? Obviously, they needed to say, sulfur dioxide is going to form sulfuric acid, and sulfuric acid is the secondary air pollutant. And so that's occurring when sulfur dioxide mixes with water in the atmosphere. That's really what we're looking for to earn that point. So Kaylee, hopefully that answers your question. Are there any other questions or concerns about how?
Let me throw in a question. If the student had, as this student did, written acid rain for part 3, but then in part 4 had mentioned sulfur dioxide combining with water to form acid rain, would they still earn the point for part 3? Or would
it's possible. Okay. I have seen that as a reader, that we've been told if they clarify their answer in a subsequent section, then they can earn those points back. So yes,
terrific.
Is the short answer.
So be specific.
Yes, be specific. You can have a recovery at parts in there, but just generally be specific. Show them that you've taken this class all year and that you really know the content. Okay. I don't see any other questions, so we'll go ahead and proceed to the next part of this one. So part C says, in 1990, Great Smoky Mountains National Park had a visibility of 25 miles. Visibility data for 2015 can be determined from the graph above. And they want you to calculate the percentage increase in visibility from 1990 to 2015 and discuss 2 specific actions that the state or federal government could take or encourage to further improve the visibility in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So let's look at the scoring guide for that. In order to calculate the percentage, you're going to take the 45 miles, and remember that 45 miles is the 2015 data, and the 1990 data is the 25 miles. So you're going to calculate a percentage, it's part over whole. You're going to look at what's the change over the original, multiply by 100 to get 80%. To do the second part, 2 specific actions that state or federal government could take. This is where it's important that you come up with a realistic action. And they even include that in the scoring guide. Sometimes they even include that in the prompt. It has to be a realistic action that the state or federal government can actually do. So some options: require or offer incentives for utilities and corporations to reduce emissions by specific methods like cap and trade, a pollution prevention control device, and hopefully you're thinking about a scrubber, electrostatic precipitator, something washing coal before burning to get rid of the sulfur. You're thinking about something that can be required that you've learned about this year. Alternative energy sources would certainly, requiring or offering incentives for utilities and corporations to use alternative energy sources would be a good way to reduce pollutants and improve visibility, new standards on equipment. You could limit the traffic in the park, but you need to explain how. So through increased parking fees, free or required shuttles, HOV, and that's, priority parking when you have more than one person in your vehicle. High occupancy vehicle is what the HOV stands for. Enact stricter standards for emissions on motor vehicles. Offer incentives to switch from gasoline powered to electric or natural gas powered vehicles. Offer tax credit or subsidies to homeowners to increase the use of renewable energy sources. Or finally, limit incineration practices or prohibit campfires to reduce air pollutants. I actually graded this exam. This was my question last year as a reader. And you have to, I remember the limit incineration practices or prohibit campfires, you had to also include how that's going to help by reducing, particulates, by reducing smoke would be sufficient. But those are all kind of the direction you're going in. And that was 1 point for the calculation, which did not have to show the work, and 2 points for this part. So that was a total of 3. So let's break down a question here. So part I, we're looking for that 80%. Sometimes for calculations, they make us show the work and sometimes they don't. We don't really expect there'll be calculations in our question this year. So that may allay some of your concerns that you have. Let's take a look at whether or not they earn the other 2 points. One thing that could be done to further improve visibility, I think they meant in the state or federal government, they could put restrictions on campfires in the park so that smoke from the fires would not reduce visibility. So that is clearly laid out in our point system, so they would earn that point. And the second one, the government could also restrict the number of vehicles coming into the park by requiring cars to park outside and take a bus or a shuttle into the park. The bus could be powered by electricity. That last statement's not needed. It's nice. That'd be a nice bonus to also power the shuttle by electricity. But they fit that second bullet up at the top, limit vehicle traffic, and they've given us a specific way. So can't just say limit vehicle traffic. They need to give us a specific way that you would do that, okay? Keeping this all as realistic as we possibly can. All right, any questions about that? They had 3 points possible and they earned all 3. So before I show you one to score and take a poll on, do you have any questions about that? Okay, let's take a look at an option for you to score. And I'll start our polling. Remember, there are 3 possible. Part I, the calculation gets 1 point, and then part II is a 2-point possible question. Once you've scored it, feel free to write something in the chat as to why you don't think they earned all those points. All right, we're at 60%. Love to get a couple more in. We've been getting close to 70 every time, so If you haven't voted for this one, go ahead and add your points to the poll. All right, I'm going to count down 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Let's end our poll. So 2 points is the result. This is actually 1 point. So they didn't necessarily have to, I'm reading the chat conversation right now. They didn't really have to put 80% in a sentence. I mean, it's, you know, it's nice, especially if you're not labeling your options, but hopefully we're all going to do that, label which one we're answering. So they still earn points even though they didn't add a label to that. For part II, they had 2 great ideas that they just didn't flesh out enough to earn points. And as a reader, you know, I'm always rooting for every test. Go the extra mile, show what you know. And so it's a bummer that they didn't explain themselves. The state or federal government could encourage carpooling. That would be a great idea to reduce pollutants. But what are they going to do? And somebody in the chat room listed that. It doesn't specify how they're going to encourage it. So how are they going to encourage carpooling? If you look up here, the HOV priority parking. So when you've got more than one person in the vehicle, you get to park a little bit closer to the entrance, or a little bit, you know, closer to the trailhead or to where the shuttle is. You know, that is encouraging carpooling. But they have to specify how they're going to do it. And then the second part, require homeowners to switch to renewable energy sources. Again, can the government make homeowners do that? They really can't. The government can't. That's not the way our government works. They can't make us do that. They could incentivize us. They could give us tax breaks. They could give us subsidies for renewable energy so that we might choose to add that in, but they can't really require homeowners to switch. So possibly a great answer if they just elaborated with how. So make sure you take the time on Monday to include that information in your answer. All right, and then part D, the last part of this question. Excluding air pollution, discuss 2 additional ways national park ecosystems are being degraded by high levels of visitor use. So this is a 2-point question. Littering or inappropriate disposal of trash can negatively impact the health of wildlife or negatively impact water quality. And remember, this is a scoring guide, but we would want to see some really specific negative impacts. Infrastructure construction or maintenance can result in habitat fragmentation. And before this evening, when I knew we were getting together, I just got out my notes from my AP read, and they can't say habitat loss. It has to be habitat fragmentation. So make sure you know that vocabulary to be sure that you can specify habitat fragmentation. So loss was not accepted for this question. Driving or walking off-road or off-path damages vegetation, increases erosion, or increases soil compaction. Those are all good options. Noise pollution can adversely impact wildlife, and you needed to follow that up with how it negatively impacts. Disrupts mating, disrupts the ranges, the migration, disrupts foraging, and the same with light pollution. How does it adversely impact wildlife? Interactions with humans or pets adversely impacts wildlife. Again, how does that happen? Visitors transporting non-native species to the park results in an increase in invasive species. Campfires can lead to wildfires. Removal of individual organisms for food, for trophies, for human use can disrupt the food web, and you should include a specific explanation about how it disrupts it. And water use for bathing and sanitation can lead to pollution of water resources. So those are all possible options for this question. Let's look at our first example. And I've left that scoring guide up there for us. One way ecosystems are being degraded are through the littering done by visitors. These parks get millions of visitors a year, and the amount of people leaving trash on the ground adds up. Animals that eat trash on the ground can become choked or poisoned. Another way national parks are degraded is when many tourists go off the path and end up trampling plants and compacting the soil. So those are have both earned points. That's a 2-point response. They didn't just say animals eat trash. but they tell us how that impacts the animal. And that's a really important point for them to earn that point. They have to go that far. And then the tourist going off path and how that impacts the ecosystem. They trample plants and they compact the soil. So again, you can see that the College Board wants to make sure that you have taken the class and you understand these impacts and can be specific about, how they're affecting the ecosystem, okay? All right, before I give you one to score, do you have any questions about the scoring guide or about that sample I just gave you? Okay. I don't see anything in the chat room, so let me go ahead and give you one to score and start our poll. Remember, this is a 2-point question. So we're certain they didn't earn any more than 2 points. And once you enter your score, if you would, not a 5-point question. Once you've entered your score, if you would comment in the chat room as to how they could make it better. You're probably seeing a pattern that I'm not giving you a perfect one the second time around. But it's great practice if you can identify how it can be better. All right, we're almost up to 60%. It's a short one to score. I'm going to go ahead and start our countdown. So if you haven't voted, please vote. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Okay, so I saw in the chat room, someone said to go into more detail as how we can make this better. Both of these are great ideas to start with, but they don't go far enough to earn any points. So you guys scored this as a 1 point. It would actually be a 0 point. So the first comment they make is ecosystems, or the first part of the response, ecosystems in national parks get degraded when lots of people scare animals. Just scaring animals is not enough to show that you've taken AP Environmental Science. So how does scaring them, how does that harm them? So you might say, it might prevent mating from happening. It might disrupt mating practices. It might cause animals to, struggle to forage for food if they're foraging for food and they're scared that they might not be able to consume enough food. So those are all legitimate ways that that could impact animals, but just scaring them was not enough to earn points. And I do remember from our reading that was really enforced. Hunting in national parks can disrupt the ecosystem. That's a good lead in, but how? How is hunting going to be a problem? And you can see our next to the last bullet said removal of individual organisms for food, trophies, or human use can disrupt the food web. So again, I would want some specifics. How is it going to disrupt the ecosystem or the food web? Hunting in national parks can remove wolves. Wolves are really important for controlling the elk population. So that is a specific, disruption that you've explained, that can really help us show that you've taken the class and understood it. You can even go farther and talk about how, if there's an increase in elk population, it's going to cause overgrazing in the park, and that's going to reduce the number of plants for other animals. So lots of ways that you can make that a little bit more specific. Let me look in the chat room here. Yes, Ms. Campbell, she's got it right. Be specific, always answer why and how in your descriptions. I've got another comment. Also, most animals in parks are more used to humans, or they stay away from where humans are. So that can be a problem. You can kind of elaborate, I guess, a little bit about why you think that's an issue. If they're staying away from humans, it might, reduce the amount of foraging that they can do, which could reduce their health. Okay, any other questions or comments about that section? I want to wrap up and give you some tips on studying in the last few days we have. Okay. So on the final lesson on YouTube from the College Board, it's called Exam Tips and Best Wishes. They give this awesome table. And I really think if you've never had an open note exam, it seems like, oh, I mean, I don't really need to study. It's going to be great. It's going to be easy. I'll just have my whole notebook there. But you know that your time is limited. So if you design a table like this, especially for approaching that environmental solutions problem that we just did, then you could list the problem. You could list, you know, how you would describe it. What are some potential solutions and some pros and cons of that solution? And you may not even need to use this table once you go through your units and think about how to come up with environmental solutions, because you're going to feel really, you know, prepared to deal with an environmental solution. I think once you prepare a table like this. So good way to organize your notes and just kind of have everything laid out on one piece of paper. I would add to that with your, for the other question, the first question on experimental design, if it helps you to have a list of things that you need to include, maybe even you want a definition of the independent variable, you could put that out, your independent variable, your dependent variable. Remember that you always need to manipulate the variable. That's part of your design. You want to include constants and a control if it's appropriate. So listing some of those things that we just discussed as what you want to remember to do for your experimental design, I think is another way to help keep you on track and keep you being specific. So a little bit of a summary. Good luck on the exam. Remember, it's going to be May 18th. It's at 4 p.m. Test your device and make sure it works. So
Debbie, let me just remind, we may have people from the Central Time Zone here, so that's 4 p.m. If you're in the Eastern Time Zone.
Yes, sorry, thinking about my time zone. So so it's going to be different if you're not in the Eastern Time Zone.
That'll be 3 o'clock Central.
Yes. Or do we just have Eastern and Central here? I think that's all of Kentucky.
I think that's all of Kentucky. We have had guests from other states and even other countries, but I'm not sure I noticed anyone here. But if you're not in the Eastern or Central Time Zone, check the College Board website or check your local time.
Yes, you want to make sure that you hit that time point. The College Board has a checklist. I had that up at the beginning of our presentation about your checklist, and they give all the time zones listed, and they also want you logging in 30 minutes before your test starts. Okay, before the 18th, test your device, make sure it works. Do that demo. Try and submit your picture. So you can test that demo as many times as you want before test day, and that's going to make you feel calm and confident that it's all going to work. Organize your notes. So that organizer I just mentioned, thinking about, you're going to have to design an experiment. So make some notes to yourself about things that you need to remember so that you'll be prepared. Be specific. So Ms. Campbell mentioned that, and that's something I think all AP teachers continually to remind our students. Be specific, include details. And this is your opportunity to show what you've learned throughout the year, okay? So you don't want to have answers that you could have come up with before you ever came into AP Environmental Science, or that your mom or dad might know about, and they've never even taken the course. So you want to show what you've learned in AP Environmental Science. Good luck, and stay strong, right? You just got to get to Monday. You guys can do it. Oh, I've got a question in the chat room. Besides increasing variation exposure, increasing the amount of individuals within each group, or altering time frame, is there any other variable you would recommend we add if they ask us how we can improve our experiment? Amount of individuals is probably your trials, number of trials. So that might be what you were going for there, Luke, in your question. It may be specific to the different types of questions that they ask. So I would check with that.
Well, terrific, Debbie. Let me just, one other suggestion that I had from the AP Biology group was to, if you were going to submit or cut and paste from a Word document or just submit a Word document, go ahead and create that document ahead of time with your AP ID number, your 8-digit ID number, and your initials at the top. Or if you're handwriting it, have several pages already written, lined or unlined paper as your preference with your ID number on the top and your initials, so that you won't have to think about doing that. You won't forget that. But,
that's a great suggestion. I'm writing that down. I'm going to be telling my kids about that tomorrow when we meet.
Okay, well, Debbie, thank you so much. AP Environmental Science students and teachers, thank you for being part of our virtual lessons, and good luck. I think if you've lasted this long, and we've been at this for over an hour, you've got amazing stamina, and it bodes well for your scores on the exam. So enjoy it. It's been a great course, and I hope to see you all again. So take care. I will sign off now and let everyone enjoy the rest of their evening. Good luck on Monday.
Enjoy your weekend.